Jakob Nacken, the giant German soldier. World War II. Jakob Nacken was born in 1906 in Dusseldorf, Germany. It was not surprising that he grew up to be incredibly tall, as both his mother and father were over 6 feet tall. In fact, tallness seemed to run in the family, as Jakob's younger sister and brother both grew up to be over 6 feet, and his older brother was a massive 6 foot 7 inches. Jakob grew to be the true giant of the family, growing to a colossal 7 foot 3 inches, though some newspapers would claim his true height was nearer to 7 foot 8. When Jakob was a teenager, there was mass unemployment in post-World War I Germany. After World War I, Germany was forced to pay for the material losses, which threw the country into a violent economic crisis. So young Jakob took advantage of his unique appearance to find a job in the show business and leave the country, traveling with a German traveling circus around Europe. At first, he was known by the stage name of Uranus, after the Greek god of the sky. But then he was more and more billed as the giant from the Rhineland, and would spend nearly the next 20 years traveling all over Europe, often headlining as Germany's tallest man. He married a 5 foot 8 inch tall girl from Belgium and seemed to be content with his minor celebrity status as a comical curiosity attraction in a circus show. He was often dressed as a cowboy or gentleman in a top hat and tails for the crowd's amusement in his shows, and he was accompanied by a child dressed as an adult in order to exaggerate his height even further. Nacken would have to wear size 17 boots as an adult and would constantly get bruises on his head from hitting the tops of doorways. But in 1939, Jakob cut short his visit to the New York Trade Fair, a year-long event showcasing the finest in business innovation, and returned home to join the army as Germany prepared to go to war. Like many Germans at the time, he returned from abroad out of patriotism rather than ideology. There's no proof that Jakob was ever a Nazi or agreed with their radical views. Once he joined the German army, he officially became their tallest soldier. By this time, he was 34 years old, which was considered to be too old at the start of the war for frontline service in the infantry. So he was assigned to an anti-tank crew and spent the war doing garrison duty, far away from the action. He never saw frontline service during those years, so his biggest challenge was to find a pair of trousers that fit him. But in the summer of 1944, he found himself stationed on the defensive line surrounding the strategically important French port of Calais. The reason this port was so important was that it was only around 21 miles from the English coastline, and therefore the most obvious point for any Allied invasion of Europe. When D-Day began on June 6th along the shoreline of Normandy, several hundred miles away, Hitler first thought it was a trick and that the real invasion would still happen at Calais. In fact, the Allies encouraged Hitler into believing this through a series of deceptions in Operation Bodyguard. So Jakob remained in the heavily fortified bunkers waiting for an attack that never happened. A month later, he and his anti-tank crew found themselves along with the rest of the Calais garrison cut off and surrounded by the Allied forces. Jakob's unit surrendered without a fight to an advancing Canadian brigade. Ironically, he was pictured surrendering to a corporal named Eldon Bob Roberts, who was just 5 foot 3 inches tall. This made headline news in both American and British newspapers and newsreels at the time, as Jakob towered over the Canadian soldier who was a full 2 feet smaller than him. It was only in 2010 that the giant man in the photograph was identified as being Jakob Nacken. Jakob was subsequently sent to Britain as a prisoner of war, where he remained for over a year. After being found to have no involvement in any war crimes, and with the war being over, he was released. He returned to his hometown of Dusseldorf in Germany, but not to the family home as it had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid during the war. Thankfully, none of his family had been killed. He spent the next 4 years doing various jobs, including work as a receptionist in the local British Officers Club. But in 1949, he and his wife decided to leave Germany and immigrated to America, where most of his family had gone to live. He was sponsored by his father's employer there, a local car dealership, and at first lived with his sister in New Jersey, who had moved there just after the war. He was keen to get back into circus life and got himself a job with an American traveling circus, where he was wrongly billed as the tallest man in the world. But now Jakob was in his mid-40s and was disillusioned with circus life, complaining about the long hours and being away for extended periods from his wife, who had stayed behind in their apartment in New York. So he left the circus after just 1 season and started a new job as a novelty Santa Claus. Now he was advertised as being the tallest Santa in the world. Jakob then went on to appear on several television shows and made a living under the stage name of Germany's Long Jake for the next 10 years. His last engagement was starring in the Broadway version of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Then he chose to retire from show business at the age of 53. Though he did still occasionally make public appearances. For instance, in 1961, Jakob dressed in the white uniform and hat of a chef, helping a department store celebrate its anniversary sale by serving free food to customers. Jakob later returned to Germany and lived to the ripe old age of 81, dying in 1987. This may have been surprising because of his height. Though Jakob was incredibly tall, he was not by far the tallest man. This title officially belonged to an American called Robert Wadlow from Missouri. He was as tall as Jakob by the time he was 13.
Obese soldiers in the military. Combat is physically strenuous, and to make sure that their armed forces are operating at their fullest potential, militaries around the world require precise standards for the health and fitness of their servicemen and women. Sometimes, however, the healthiest and fittest individuals are not always available, and the armed services are forced to recruit those who are not at their peak physically. Although rare, overweight warriors have been fighting for millennia, in ancient Rome, gladiators were fed high amounts of barley gruel specifically to put on the pounds, the extra mass acting as a built-in body armor to protect them from the swords of their opponents in the arena. Centuries later, after getting badly injured in a jousting accident, the once fit and athletic King Henry VIII of England became immobile and began piling on the pounds until he weighed in at about 400 pounds, together with a 52-inch waist, and had to have specially crafted armor made to accommodate his mighty frame, and even a custom-built wooden platform to enable him to mount his warhorse. Overall, the majority of those engaged in combat endured lives of hard physical labor and a limited caloric intake. In the major wars of the 20th century, one of the main issues with recruitment during these times was underweight soldiers. During both world wars, thousands of conscripts and volunteers were rejected for being undernourished, the fear being that these men would not have the strength, stamina, or sheer physical capabilities needed to perform the arduous duties of a soldier. When recruits did arrive for basic training, those who were overweight quickly shed the pounds. During the Second World War, it was recognized that an average man of military age would require about 2,400 calories a day without engaging in any activity, the energy requirements then spiking due to the physical necessities of military service, countless miles of marching, hauling upwards of 60 pounds of equipment around, running, shooting, and the myriad of other metabolically taxing situations soldiers may find themselves in. Though the exact makeup and nutritional value required varied from country to country, most militaries try to issue their soldiers between 3,500 and 4,700 calories a day. Even with these seemingly high caloric rations, it was not uncommon for those carrying the extra pounds to lose the excess weight while in service. If a potential recruit was severely obese, he would almost certainly be rejected from service on medical grounds, as someone who was that unfit was going to be more of a liability than an asset. There were some exceptions to this, though. During both world wars, the industrial scale of the conflicts forced entire nations to mobilize. Citizens from all walks of life were sent off to fight for their homeland, and the majorly overweight were no exception. In Britain, for example, former service members aged 41 to 55 were organized into the Home Guard. Many of these men were veterans of the Great War and were familiar with the rigors of Army life. But with 2 decades between service, their most physically active days were behind them. These middle-aged men were eager to put on a uniform again, but many of them were more rotund than the last time they had worn one. These men were not expected to fight, the only exception being if the island was invaded. They were not subject to the same PT requirements of their younger peers who would see frontline service. Instead, they busied themselves with anti-aircraft duties, guarding airfields and other installations, and manned beach defenses. None of these tasks required significant caloric expenditure. Likewise, across the English Channel, the German military was also forced to utilize the overweight. After suffering titanic losses, especially on the Eastern Front, the Germans called up those who were less physically fit to fill the ranks that were rapidly being depleted. It's difficult to get exact figures, but pictorial evidence shows overweight soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms almost certainly on garrison duty where they did not have to face the high energy expenditure of their frontline comrades. Like their British counterparts, these duties included manning anti-aircraft guns, garrison duty, especially in occupied territories, and monitoring beaches along the Atlantic Wall. By putting these out-of-shape men in these locations, physically active soldiers were freed up to fight on the front lines elsewhere. While most overweight soldiers were sent to rear echelon duties, there were some exceptions to this rule. During the Vietnam War, the American military deliberately placed at risk those that would normally be considered unfit for service. Officially known as Project 100,000 and more cynically referred to as McNamara's morons, this was a deliberate attempt to place less than capable individuals in combat roles. The majority of the unwitting participants in this program were men of a lower IQ and with limited mental faculties, but also consisted of a number of men who were both underweight and overweight by military standards. For those who were overweight, they could be up to 20% heavier than the normal standards would allow. In order for the experiment to run properly, these men would be treated to the exact same physical standards as their more fit comrades. While no doubt some of the men did lose weight under the rigors of military life, they would often be assigned additional training, called the Medically Remedial Enlistment Program, in order to correct their physical condition, including carrying the extra pounds. Otherwise, performance standards of these recruits were not lowered in any way, or the experiment that was Project 100,000 would be invalidated. Although there is no information about overweight soldiers and their direct combat performance, what is known is that McNamara's morons as a whole suffered casualty rates in excess of twice that of their peers. Fighting the flab continues to this day, and in recent decades many Western countries have experienced a sharp increase in their obesity rate. As a result, the pool of recruits a nation could draw upon is increasingly consisting of the overweight and the obese. In a recent survey, the U.S. military has found that 20% of male recruits and 40% of female recruits are heavier than normal, requiring them to lose the pounds before being able to serve their country. In spite of this, a reported 20% of active-duty American military personnel are still overweight. In Great Britain, while not quite as severe, approximately 1 in 10 British personnel are considered to be exceeding the standards for a healthy BMI, or body mass index. There are theories as to why this is happening. One factor may be the sedentary nature of military service today. Many tasks are now computerized, meaning that the soldier spends a lot of time sitting in front of a computer screen, rather than hauling 60 or more pounds of gear through difficult conditions for hours, if not days on end. Exacerbating this issue is the food served on military bases. Fast food chains often set up shop in or near military bases, and they're often frequented by soldiers stationed nearby, their calorie-dense menus contributing to this growing problem. Even combat zones are not safe from the scourge of fast food. In 2003, shortly after the invasion of Iraq, 2 popular fast food franchises set up stations at a coalition military base located near Basra and were soon joined by others. Fast food locations soon sprang up at other American and British bases throughout the country. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, coalition soldiers were able to sample their favorite takeaway menus with a myriad of fast food restaurants, all ready to serve those in uniform. The rationale for having such unhealthy food is that it provides a morale boost for those in the field, giving them a taste of home while deployed overseas. While the rank and file should ideally be kept in shape, the commanders are a different matter entirely. During the Second World War, the commander of Germany's Luftwaffe Air Force was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who was well known for his flamboyant lifestyle, as well as his impressive girth. A slim and dashing fighter pilot during the First World War, he developed a morphine addiction after recovering from injuries sustained during Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923, which contributed to his erratic behavior and mood swings, which may have led to his overindulgence for food and alcohol. By the time of the Second World War, he had ballooned to around 300 pounds, though his weight did fluctuate, as he would occasionally go on crash diets to lose the extra pounds, something the Allied propaganda program was eager to capitalize on. Numerous depictions of him in propaganda images show Göring as a rotund individual covered in medals, a flamboyant character to be made fun of. After his capture, American guards during the Nuremberg trials referred to him as the Fat One. Even in the modern day, there are some commanders who take to the field while obviously totally out of shape. In the current war in Ukraine, there have been speculative reports of a certain General Pavel, a retired army officer who Vladimir Putin has recalled to active service in light of the Russian losses in the conflict. General Pavel is believed to be a 69-year-old former officer who spent his retirement enjoying the finer things in life, eating a reported 5 full meals a day, washing it all down with a liter of vodka. It has been reported by certain media outlets that even the largest size body armor is too small to fit his massive frame, requiring 2 vests spliced together to provide adequate protection. It turns out, however, that reports of General Pavel are grossly exaggerated. Fact-checkers looked into the absurd story, and it was revealed that Pavel is in fact a 58-year-old Border Patrol officer named Ivan Turchin. Further research has provided no evidence that he has been sent to Ukraine or has any other involvement in that conflict. While General Pavel is a fabrication of the media, what is true is the use of obese individuals for propaganda purposes. Much like Hermann Goering in the Second World War, this is a case where an overweight man was lampooned to highlight the absurdity of the opposing side. Recently, many people have expressed concerns about the current obesity epidemic plaguing many societies, and the lack of physically fit recruits is seen as a national security issue. Whether this is true or not, history provides many examples of heavy-set warriors, whether these individuals serve due to desperation, as an experiment in combat effectiveness, or simply the nature of their line of work. What is clear is that warriors can come in all shapes and sizes.
Richard Flaherty, the smallest man to serve in the U.S. Army. In the modern history of the United States Armed Forces, Captain Richard J. Flaherty was remembered not only for his undisputed bravery and determination, but also for his distinctive stature. The Giant Killer, as his comrades in arms called him, was the smallest man to serve in the military of the United States. With a height of only 4 feet 9 inches and weighing just 97 pounds, he wasn't even supposed to enter the force. The Army was his life's dream, though, and he was determined to make it happen contrary to other people's opinions. Flaherty's short stature marked his entire life, starting from early childhood. He was lucky to be born at all. His mother's blood problems caused a hormonal disbalance, and it almost cost Richard his life as a baby. This problem ultimately resulted in his stunted growth. When Flaherty became a teenager, the issue became an enormous burden for him. He had to put up with constant staring in school and was often mistaken as a freshman when he was a senior. Flaherty was aware of his height and did everything in his power to overcome it by becoming stronger. Engaged in practicing martial arts, he would often spend time breaking wooden boards or hitting bricks with his bare hands. It was as if, even at that point in his life, he knew his destiny was to be a fearsome warrior. Upon finishing high school, the opportunity came for his wish to come true, to join the U.S. Army. He desperately wanted to do his patriotic duty and serve in the Vietnam War that was raging in Asia at the time. The problem was that the Army's minimum height requirement was 5 feet. Flaherty was 3 inches short, but big on confidence and determination to get in. After reaching out to his congressman, who passed his wish on to an unknown 3-star general, Flaherty was allowed to enter the initial entry training at Fort Jackson, North Carolina. Problems regarding his stature followed Flaherty in the Army as well. Upon showing up on the first day of his course on the inspection line, he was welcomed by the drill sergeant with the words, "What the heck is this?" Flaherty already knew he would have to work twice as hard as anyone else to break everyone's prejudices. It was to the amazement of the drill sergeants and other recruits that Flaherty, aka Private Mighty Mouse, always ended up in the top 5 position on all the courses. When he was supposed to climb over the wooden wall obstacle, he would do it with the help of a sharpened screwdriver with the same swiftness as the other soldiers. Besides the various obstacles, Flaherty also had to fight with the disdain of other recruits who found him unworthy to be a soldier. Only after he showed his teeth in a fight against a recruit twice as large who always picked on him did he earn the respect he fully deserved from his peers. It was only thanks to his powerful will that Flaherty finished the basic and advanced infantry course and earned an offer to enter the officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. After graduating from OCS, including the jump school, Flaherty was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home to one of the most legendary units of the U.S. Army, the 101st Airborne Division. From there, in December 1967, just prior to the Tet Offensive, Flaherty went to Vietnam, deployed at the Bien Hoa Air Base. In Vietnam, Flaherty was engaged as a platoon leader on search and destroy missions. It was a remarkably tough job, with days spent in the deep jungle setting up ambushes and hunting down the enemy. Flaherty and the men from his platoon, like the rest of the 101st Airborne, were always in the center of the action. In accordance with his personality, Flaherty was always there to lead. At one point, he was even wounded from gunfire and grenade shrapnel, but recovered and went back into the action fighting like there was no tomorrow. Like everything else in his life, Flaherty even fought a war his own way. He did all he could do to overcome his lack of height. To drive an old ambulance truck, he fitted the pedals with wooden blocks so he could reach them. He could barely see over the wheel, but that didn't stop him from doing his duty. For his gallantry shown in combat, Flaherty earned his highest decoration, the Silver Star Medal. On early April 19, 1968, 2nd Lieutenant Flaherty, 3rd Platoon Leader, along with the officers of Company C, 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, was presented with Operation Delaware. Flaherty's unit was tasked with blocking the enemy's supply routes to the Ashaw Valley, where primary operations were conducted. Flaherty had already seen some fierce combat by this time, but this operation was especially intense. Company C faced a determined enemy. The NVA were fighting en masse, and Flaherty and his men were pushing them back only thanks to the support of artillery. Flaherty was determined not to give in, and he encouraged his men to fight. It was April 20th, the second day of the operation. Several soldiers from the company were lost behind enemy lines from the previous day. It seemed like they were lost for good, but not to Flaherty. He wanted to show that no man was to be left behind, a pure example of leadership. He ordered his men to bring over the body of a dead NVA soldier, the smallest one they could find. Flaherty stripped the uniform from the dead enemy and put it on along with a helmet to cover his face as a disguise, grabbed an AK-47, and crawled over towards the lost men. Under the cover of night, he passed by enemy NVA and gathered the lost American soldiers. For once, his height was of great use. Only thanks to Flaherty being short and brave were 5 soldiers saved from certain death. Later that day, Company C continued attacking the enemy positions. The NVA threw everything they had at them. At one point, the company got pinned down by automatic fire from an enemy bunker. Any further progress would have been impossible until it was eliminated. Flaherty maneuvered his men to outflank the enemy. After exposing himself to enemy fire several times, he reached a position that gave him a clear view of the emplacement. He then called for a 90mm recoilless rifle team to his position. Flaherty directed the fire towards the bunker and destroyed it, therefore relieving pressure on his unit. Company C then continued with its attack and accomplished its mission. From that point on, there was absolutely no doubt that Richard Flaherty was among one of the best the 101st Airborne had. He was promoted to the rank of 1st Lieutenant and recommended for the Silver Star Medal, which he later received. Flaherty's wishes were, however, connected to another unit, the Green Berets. After he finished his tour of duty, Flaherty decided to do what seemed to be impossible, and attempt to join the U.S. Elite Special Forces, the Green Berets. But first, he had to get yet another height waiver before being allowed to apply. But his determination paid off, and he got through the punishing selection process with flying colors. The following year, he was back in Vietnam, engaged in special operations behind enemy lines. This period of his service was shrouded in mystery, but what is known is that he received a rank of captain, 2 bronze medals, and 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds. In the early 1970s, the armed forces of the United States were struck by a notorious reduction in force. The first to be ousted were the captains and lieutenants, and Flaherty was one of them. In 1971, he became jobless. Richard returned home to New York, where he was welcomed by family and friends as a hero. It was a moment of joy, but also the beginning of Flaherty's downfall. He tried to start a life as a civilian by getting a job, and even went to study at the University of Miami. This whole new life was, however, too tough for him. It all went downhill in 1975 when his fiancée died. Flaherty returned to doing what he knew best, but his later life is mainly shrouded in mystery. But there are people who witnessed his engagements in Africa, working for private contractors, and as an agent working for the CIA and DEA. Somehow, in the early 1990s, Flaherty ended up in Aventura homeless shelter in Florida. In the early hours of the morning of May 9, 2015, Flaherty was killed in Miami by a hit-and-run driver. Captain Richard Flaherty was a hero cut from the Army, to which he gave everything he had and more. Despite his short height, he had left a mark on the military as one of the best the 101st Airborne had. He was the Giant Killer.